this kind of user authentication, but you may not be aware of the backend of the password authentication system. For example, how does operating system like Windows, Unix store and compare the user password, and what are some general attacks that can be applied in password authentication, and what are the prevention mechanisms, and so on. Alright, so we will look at what is authentication, the definition, and then some basis. For example, some authentication factors we can use in different authentication systems. And then we will look at some concept like false positive and false negative. So these are basically the error in that can occur in authentication. So false positive means you have you give a wrong credential, but you can still authenticate. But false negative means you give the correct, maybe you provide the correct authentication factor, but you are denied by the system. Right, so then we will look at this password-based authentication. We will look at some general attacks, and then how to prevent those attacks. In particular, we will look at the storage of password. So actually, we don't store the plain password. We store a transformed password. We will use something called a hash function. So in 361, you study the details of the hash function. But in this subject, we only use the hash function as a tool. And the security properties of hash function is they are related to these concepts like false positive and false negative. So later we will see why, for example, the one-wayness or so-called pre-image resistance and also the collision resistance can be related to a false positive and a false negative. And then we just beside the hashing, sometimes we will also do the so-called sorting. So this is another technique used by the Unix system to store the user password. Right, so we will also look at some attacks that can be performed against the password authentication. For example, in assignment 1, you will need to implement a so-called rainbow table. So rainbow table is some pre-computed hash table that will allow the user to the attacker to quickly identify the user password. So we will look at how it works, and then I will explain what you need to implement in the assignment 1, in the programming part. Okay, so now let's, so we will have a break in the middle probably. So we will just first look at some general concepts and some definitions related to authentication. So first, what is user authentication? So authentication, as I mentioned just now, is identifying the identity of the user. So we want to know who the user is, whether the user is legitimate or not, and who the user is. So that's the first step we need to do before actually we can do other security mechanisms. So right, so if whenever you want to log into a system, basically you first need to do a user authentication. For example, if you want to go to internet banking, or even if you want to use the Wi-Fi network here, so you need to provide your username, password. So this is basically where we do the user authentication. Right, so the server, for example, providing the service, will need to first verify this is a legitimate user. And then the server will decide what the user can do after the identity of the user is recognized. So that means we can only do access control or other security mechanisms after we perform the authentication. So there are different ways we can perform authentication, and these forms the basis or the factors for authentication. So some common factors include, for example, a password, which is something you know. Right, so a password or secret, which is something you know, and then something you have. Right, for example, you can have a mobile phone, or you can have a smart card. So the smart card allows the user to, for example, enter a room when you scan the smart card or the RFID card by a reader. So in this case, you have a physical object. So this is something you have, right? So, and then you can also use biometric information. For example, your fingerprint or your voice right? So to do this authentication. So actually some more advanced biometric authentication mechanism, including like the signal. So detecting by collecting the signal generated by your brain. Actually, we can also do authentication. So there are some research. There is some research performed in this kind in more advanced authentication based on our brain signal. So actually, this is a quite interesting research area. So I just hosted a researcher, so from Europe. So what he did is he produced some device that can be wear by the user. So the user just wear the device, and then the device actually will detect the signal generated by the brain. So in this case, you don't need to physically enter the password. So you can just do a so-called silent talk. So you can just silently think about something, some secret. Then actually the signal actually will identify the user. So even the different users, they silently think about, silently talk something, the same sentence or same secret. Actually, the signal is different because each one actually will generate a different signal by the brain. So that's some more advanced authentication actually we can use. So this is based on biometric. So the common biometric authentication we use actually. So for example, if you want to log into your smartphone, you can use your fingerprint, right? And sometimes we can also use voice or face recognition to enter a system. So that's biometric. And then where the entity is, for example, if you are using a particular machine inside the internet, then you can directly access the resource. You can directly connect to a server if you are one of the machines within the internet. But if you say you are in this case, authentication is done, for example, by IP address. So if we know this IP address is the internal IP address, then the user actually can directly access. But if you are the external user, then probably you need to first establish a VPN, right? So after you establish a VPN, actually the external machine will be treated as the internal machine. So in this case, you can also access the resource. So this is basically another type of authentication, and then who the entity knows. So this is also something used in social networks. For example, if you want to reset your password, sometimes the system will ask you to provide the information of a few of your friends in your social network, and then only when all of them actually send a response, say okay, this they try to certify this is the particular user, then actually the user is allowed to retrieve the password or reset the password. So in this case, we use maybe our social network as an authentication factor. So we can use different types of mechanisms or a combination of them to do authentication. So if we want to have a higher level of security, we can use two-factor or multi-factor authentication, right? Two-factor authentication. Nowadays, if you do the e-banking, so the common two-factor authentication will require both password and also a device. So you can have a DBS, you will receive a token. So the token will generate a one-time password, right? Every time you press the token, it will generate a one-time password. You need to use your permanent password, long-term password, together with one-time password to log in. So some other systems, they use a mobile phone. Like in Australia, actually, we don't use this kind of hardware token. We use mobile phone. Every time we want to perform we want to log in, we need to type in our password, and then I will receive a one-time password through my mobile phone, and then I can use a one-time password to log in. So this is a two-factor authentication. And then if we look at the ATM card we use, that's also a two-factor authentication mechanism, because you need to know the PIN, and also you need to physically have the card if you want to withdraw money. Otherwise, if you only have the password or you only have the card, you cannot withdraw the money. So that's also two-factor authentication. So we can use different ways to do authentication to identify this user. So we can use, in general, we can use all the mechanisms, all the factors presented in the previous slide. But the three common ones we use include something you have, right? So something you know and something you are. So these are the like big three. So these are the three common methods we use for authentication. And then today we will mainly focus on something you know, so the password. And then next class we will look at a combination of like different factors. So something you know, something you have, something you are, and we can have different combinations. And we will look at some examples we use in reality to do multi-factor authentication. Right, so the authentication is related to the term credential. Okay, so the credential is something we use to prove our identity. So in general, we have the identifier credential. That means some object that allows people to recognize the identity recognize our identity. So another credential that can also be used for different purposes is the so-called authorization credential, right? So in basically for like a network security and system security, we can have different credentials, right? So we can have this public key certificate, which is like some sort of identity credential, and then we can also have the attribute certificate, which is for authorization. All right, so however, sometimes we will also see some like inaccurate or ambiguous definition of credential. So these are some other definitions which actually are not recommended. So if we see all these definitions are from this RFC. So RFC stands for request for comment. So these are all the some standards, security standard or other standard related to internet technology. So if you go to this IETF website, you can find all the RFCs, and then this RFC is for basically the terms that will occur in other standard. So actually, credential is a term that will occur in different authentication and authorization systems. However, so in that document, they also provide some so-called deprecated definitions. That means that these definitions, although they are specified in some standard documents, but we should avoid using such kind of definition because they are ambiguous and inaccurate. Right. So in English, actually, credential basically is something that can support a claim of identity or authorization, right? So this is basically the normal plain English definition of a credential. But anyway, so this is just to give you some general idea. So how we basically use how we define the information we use to pass authentication or do authorization. Right, so for the authentication, we have two important concepts. So password, basically, if we use either password or biometric or even other authentication factor, we can always have these two errors. One is called a false positive, one is called false negative. So these are the two types of error that can occur when we do authentication. So no matter which authentication mechanism you use, so we can have this kind of errors. For example, so when you use your fingerprint to log into iPhone, sometimes actually it will be denied. So even if you use the correct finger, you will be denied. So in this case, actually, we have the so-called false negative. And then sometimes, so although this is less likely, but theoretically this is possible. Someone may use a wrong password to log into your account. Right, so this is called a false positive. So these two concepts actually not only appear in authentication, but later we will see they appear in other systems as well. So for example, even we do a medical check, we can have the false positive and false negative. And in intrusion detection, of course, like an antivirus, we can also have these kind of errors. Right, so in these systems, for example, the intrusion detection system in IDS. So false positive now has a different meaning because the context is different. It means actually we give a false alarm. So there is no intrusion, but the system gives a false alarm. So false negative means that there is an intrusion, but we didn't receive any alarm from the intrusion detection system. So these kind of errors can happen in different systems, including many security systems. Okay, so false positive, as I mentioned, this occurs when we make a match, but we shouldn't have. So in authentication, that means someone may use a wrong credential. So now I use the term credential instead of a password because depending on the factor you use. So if you use a wrong credential, you can still pass authentication. That means you have a false positive. As I mentioned just now, so if you use a fingerprint to unlock your smartphone, sometimes you can have so this is false negative. So sometimes actually if you use for false positive, so sometimes maybe you can have a wrong credential, but the system will still accept this wrong credential. So we will see why this can happen, for example, in password-based authentication. Alright, so in biometric, actually this can also happen if the system is not really accurate. Because in biometric authentication, usually you need to do a registration. For example, you register your fingerprint or you register your face, right? So in this case, so the database will, the system will collect your biometric data and then store in the database. And then later, when you do authentication, it will collect another pattern, the current pattern collected from the user. So then they will do the matching between the two patterns. So now in this case, both false positive and false negative can happen. So for example, if say this is actually the data collected from the right user, just like the example of unlock your smartphone. So this is from the correct user's fingerprint. But now because the measurement maybe is there is some issue. For example, your hand is not there is dirt in your hand, in your finger. So when the fingerprint is collected, actually there are a lot of errors. Then actually the matching fails. In this case, you have a false negative. But sometimes, say if the accuracy level is very low, so even you collect a different a sample, but in this case even the sample is wrong, but you still have a match. Then in this case you have a false positive. So in biometric authentication, so you can have both false positive and false negative, depending on the matching, whether the accuracy of this matching and also whether there is any errors during the collection of the information. Alright, so for password-based authentication, actually we will have a false positive. False negative is less likely, but we will have false positive because actually we don't store the plain password in for example, in your PC, in your Unix or Windows system. We don't store the plain password. We store a transformed password. So in this case, there is a chance that two different passwords, after the transformation, they become the same. So in this case, if you use a wrong password, you may still be able to log into the account. So that's where false positive can occur in password-based system. Right. So this can also happen. So later we will see, when we see malware or intrusion detection, we can also have false positive. But actually from the user's view, the effect of false positive and false negative can be quite different. So in authentication, user will be aware of false negative. That means when actually the user uses a correct credential but denied by the system, then user will be aware. But in the intrusion detection or antivirus systems, user will be aware of false positive. That means when actually there is no intrusion or no malware, when there is no malware, but this intrusion detection or anti-malware system, they give alarm, then we will be aware of this kind of false positive. So depending on context, so sometimes we will have in authentication when user will be aware of the false negative, but in intrusion detection or antivirus systems, users will be aware of false positive. Right? So these are the two errors that can occur in different security systems. Okay, so now let's look at, so basically as I said, for password-based systems, actually we will have a false positive. So for the false positive, we have the so-called false acceptance rate. So this is the FAR. It means the false positive that will be accepted by the system. And then FRR is for false negative, the false rejection rate. That means the valid login request or authentication request that will be rejected by the system. So later we will see, actually, as I mentioned, FAR, the false positive, actually makes sense when we actually store the transform the password instead of the plain password. So now let's look at the password-based authentication. So this mechanism is widely used. So we use password authentication almost every day. So when you want to log into your system, when you want to log into your computer, or you want to log into your email account or bank account and so on. So we use password every day. However, so password-based authentication is actually the weakest, actually one of the weakest method for authentication. The reason why this is the weakest, because the password actually, they are very weak in terms of security strength. Because the space of the password actually is quite limited. So password space usually is not sufficient to withstand many attacks. For later we will see there are different types of attacks, like the brute force attack, dictionary attack, rainbow table attack, and so on. So all these attacks are based on the weakness of the password. So because password actually, they are quite, the number of possible passwords, they are quite limited. Alright, so this is although this is very a weak authentication mechanism, but this is the most convenient mechanism for authentication. So that's why we still use this one. However, so nowadays we try to use password-based authentication together with some other authentication mechanism that can basically somehow address the limitation of password. So this is how usually a password system works. So you need to register an account, you need to provide a password. So the system sometimes will give you some specific rules. So you need to have a capital letter, lowercase letter, special symbols, numbers, and so on. Right? So then after you register the account, then you can basically log into the account. Of course, you may also need to provide some other information, for example, email account or some questions, the answers to some questions, so that later you can reset your password. Right? So after you do the registration, you do the authentication using password, and when you want to reset your password, you need to either use your email address or account, or you need to answer the security questions and so on. So this is how the password system works. And then the authentication, the second step actually is done by basically a matching, whether the user, the supplied information matches the information stored in the security database, right? So if the information supplied actually match what is expected, then the user is authenticated. So here actually, so the matching depends on actually what is stored in the database of the system. So it's not based on what the user is supplied. So it's based on what is stored in the database. So in this case, if the stored information is not a plain password, then we can have the so-called false positive. Because if the stored information is a transformed password, then it is possible that you can have different password which will have the same, produce the same transformed password. So in this case, we have a false positive, right? So, but it's less likely you provide the same password, then you produce different transformed password. It's less likely. So, in general, we can have a false positive if we use a transformed password instead of a plain password. All right. So we will look at some problems, security problems related to password. Many of these are common sense. So, if you look at these problems, actually, they don't require any math or any advanced knowledge. So password guessing, password exposure, and then Trojan horse, like the keyloggers, and then core password is where we will focus on. So These are some methods that actually some straightforward method that can be used to compromise the password system, but so they depend on basically the user behavior, user habit, and so on. However, so how to select a good password? This is something actually we can study, we can improve in order to prevent some other attacks. So we will look at the attacks. For example, the dictionary attack. So this is a particular attack against the password, because password has a so-called low entropy. We will have a very small space for the password. Then we can build a dictionary to capture that all the possible password. So this is the so-called dictionary attack. So brute force attack. So basically, if you know the space of the password, you can use a dictionary. But if you don't know the space, you can use the so-called brute force attack. And then you can also have hybrid attack, right? So hybrid attack is a combination of dictionary attack and brute force attack. Then for all these attacks, actually, for the dictionary brute force, you can also have the so-called online and offline attack. So the online attack actually is less serious, less critical than offline attack, right? So we will look at the difference. Password guessing, this is quite straightforward. So you just make a random guess about password. For example, if you know the student account, your classmate account, then you can just randomly pick a password and then try to log into the account. So this is a quite straightforward attack. So, but this can be prevented actually quite easily. So the normal prevention is to limit the number of failed logins. So if you have a particular account has say 5 consecutive failed logins, then the account will be locked. So in this case, we can easily prevent this kind of password guessing. All right. So, but this can be although we can stop the attacker from logging into the account, but this can also be used by attacker to launch a denial of service attack. So if I want to lock your account, I can just type in the wrong password 5 times, then your account will be locked, right? So anyway, so we will look at denial of service later. So password exposure, this is another very straightforward problem. So because nowadays we use a lot of different passwords, so sometimes password users may write down their password, maybe in a piece of paper or in a file. So in this case, actually, if someone can access that information, then that piece of paper or that file, then all the password will be exposed. And then if you type in your password, actually, someone may just stand behind your shoulder and then watch your the password you entered. So in some study, actually, it has been demonstrated. So even if you use your ATM, when you type in your password, actually by monitoring the movement of your elbow, so actually people can identify what is the password entered by the user. So someone has done some study to illustrate actually this kind of attack is possible. So password exposure is basically a problem when we have someone who can observe observe the process that the user enters a password. Okay, so the Trojan horse, this is another threat. So this is about keyloggers. So Trojan horse, this is one of the topics we will study in malware, but it can be linked to authentication because Trojan horse can actually do a lot of later we will see Trojan horse actually can do a lot of malicious activities, not just the keylogger. So later it can also used by phishing attacks or other attacks, because Trojan horse actually it can, once the Trojan horse is installed in your machine, then actually it can do a lot of other attacks. So for the authentication, the keylogger basically is to log all the keyboard keystroke done by the user. So basically, this can be done actually in a very accurate way. So for example, the Trojan horse can detect whenever the user opens a particular address or whenever the user accesses a particular system, like a bank e-banking system, then the Trojan horse will enable the, for example, the keylogger. And sometimes this is difficult to detect. For example, the Trojan horse is embedded in a game. So because the game has some similar, in computer games, we have some like a similar function as a keylogger. Because when you play the game, actually the game need to recognize your keystroke as well, right? So when you enter some keys, the game will need to recognize. And the behavior is very similar as a keylogger. So if you embed the keylogger in a game, sometimes actually we cannot detect there is a keylogger inside. But the keylogger actually can now basically capture what the user typed in the keyboard. And the Trojan horse can also capture, for example, sometimes they can also capture the screen in order to steal the user password if they use some other mechanism. For example, some systems, they don't let the user type the password using keyboard. They will display a keyboard on the page, right? They display a visual keyboard, and then you need to press those, using the mouse to press those keys in this keyboard. And then Trojan horse actually can still basically do the capturing. So they can do the screen capture in order to recognize what are the keys typed by the user. Right. So these are some attacks that can be used against the password. And however, in general, so later we will see actually the more critical or dangerous attacks are related to the quality of the password. So the reason of those attacks, the possibility of those attacks is due to the so-called low entropy of the password. So in general, so if we choose a password, the number of possibilities actually is quite limited. So suppose you choose just like a PIN, for your ATM card. So you choose 6 digits, that's only 1 million possibilities. And even if you choose some secure password, actually the possibility is still quite limited compared with cryptographic key. So the strength of the password is usually very weak. So that's the major problem in password systems. Although the previous attacks can also basically compromise the password, but the main problem of a password-based system is the quality of the secret. So in this case, the entropy or the amount of uncertainty in the password is quite low. So in this case, we have different types of attacks, like a dictionary attack, brute force attack, and so on. Because given the limited number of possible passwords, attacker can enumerate the possible password and then try to identify which is the correct password. All right. So, however, so we cannot address this problem by simply using the password without any additional system, because the reason is that our human memory actually is very constrained. So we cannot really memorize very long random strings. We can memorize structured strings, but we cannot memorize very long random strings. For the structured strings, actually, although you can produce a very long password, but actually the total amount of possibility is still very limited. So in this case, the attacker can still basically enumerate all the possibilities. All right. So in order to prevent, so basically, if we want to address this problem, we need to use some other factors to enhance the security. All right. So anyway, so although we have some limitation, but we can still try our best to improve the quality of the password. So before we look at how we can improve the quality, we will look at some particular attacks. So the first one is dictionary attack. So dictionary attack is quite straightforward. So given that attacker, because each system, actually they will have some rules for the password. So based on those rules, actually we can define a dictionary. So the dictionary can contain all the possible passwords, right? So for example, for the ATM card, actually we know the dictionary for 6-digit password, we only have 1 million possibilities, right? From 60 to 69. So that's these are the all the possible passwords we can use. So in this case, we can build a dictionary which contains all the 6-digit numbers. And then for other systems, we can build some similar a dictionary. So here, dictionary may not just mean like English dictionary or a dictionary for a particular alphabet. We can have like a dictionary for all the numbers, all the digits, and so on. So as far as the attacker knows the scope, like the domain of the password, then they can build a dictionary. And then after they build a dictionary, and once they get some additional information about password, they can check against each possible password in the dictionary, right? So this is the dictionary attack. So for example, if somehow the password table in the system is stolen by the attacker, so the attacker now gets some transformed password. Now the attacker can basically check against the whole dictionary one by one. So you do a transformation for each password. If the transformed password match what you obtained from the password table, then you know you get the correct password, right? So in this case, we can break the system by just checking the possible passwords one by one. Right, so in general, so dictionary, although we can build the a dictionary containing all the possible passwords, and sometimes the attacker actually will use some tailored dictionary. So this is in conjunction with the so-called social engineering. So basically, the attacker, if we have a specific target, we may predict the password from some information we know about this target. For example, if I know this guy is very interested in a particular type of sport, right? For example, basketball or tennis and so on. And then there is a favorite sport superstar in that a particular sport. And then so in this case, actually, sometimes you can predict, for example, the password. You can reduce the number of possible passwords by looking at the information you can collect from that particular person. So we call such kind of attack tailored dictionary attack, because in general, people will not really choose a pure random password. So if you think about the password you chose, actually there are still some information related to your life, right? So you don't really choose a pure random password. So that's why actually by doing social engineering, we can reduce the space. We can reduce the size of the dictionary. So in this case, we can have this so-called tailored dictionary. So we don't generate the whole list of possible password, but we generate a specific subset of the password. So in UW, in one of the labs, we do such a kind of attack. So actually, you may be surprised if you really perform such an attack. So in general, basically, I assume, for example, I pretend to be someone, and then I pick some password, and then I ask you to ask me some question. For example, you are doing a survey or something, so you can ask me some question, and then basically I will answer your question. And then in the lab, we have in each lab we have 30+ students, and the student will ask some question, then we will answer the question using all those questions are normal questions. So we don't allow students to directly ask, what's your password? What's your previous password? So we don't allow this kind of question. So they can ask, for example, where do I graduate? So how old are you? How old I am? Then what's the date of birth? So what's my date of birth? So what's my favorite animal? What's my favorite sport? What's the information about my children? Where do they attend school? So they ask all this information. So this kind of question can appear in the survey, in general a survey. So, but you may be surprised actually, even if I choose some random password from, not truly random, some password I randomly combine from different sources. So I combine this piece, that piece, a third piece, I combine them to form the password. Actually, in general, it takes 20 to 30 minutes for the students to locate the password. So every time, actually, the student locate password by asking those questions. So actually, this kind of social engineering attack is quite powerful. You should not underestimate this kind of attacks. So by actually asking those questions, the student, every time actually they can successfully identify the password. Even I randomly pick different pieces, combine them together. The reason is I don't actually choose a truly random password. I combine some piece. For example, this is my favorite pen. Okay, so maybe this is like information, some information maybe related to my children. So I randomly combine them, but actually the student, they can still identify the password. So this is basically the tailored dictionary attack. So that's something actually we should be careful when we try to do some surveys and so on. So that's why also why when some hacker can collect user information, so those information can be sold to the attackers, because attacker may do this kind of tailored password attack. Attacker may also perform some tailored phishing. So the phishing can also be tailored based on the information known by the attacker. So anyway, so that's about the tailored password attack. Then brute force, this is basically another straightforward attack. So we assume the attacker knows nothing. So attacker has no information. Attacker even does not know the space. For example, attacker even does not know how the password is, what are the rules to form the password. In this case, we can use brute force. Brute force, essentially, you just try all the possibilities. Right, so in general, so the brute force attack can always locate the password. It is just a matter of time. So if we give the attacker sufficient time and sufficient resource, then basically the attacker can locate the password for sure using brute force. However, so to defend this kind of attack, so the one mechanism is basically to change your password frequently. So every 3 months or every 5 months, you need to change the password. So this is the only way that can prevent the brute force attack. Because brute force, if you keep a static password forever, and the brute force basically will just do all the possible, do the search for all the possible strings. In this case, it's just a matter of time to find your password. Okay, so how to measure the security or the strength of the password? So actually we have some simple mathematics and some a simple definition that can be used. So basically we can determine the strength of a password by looking at the size of the password space. How many possible passwords that can be generated in that space, and then basically we can then look at the speed of the computer or the speed of the attacker for enumerating the password. For example, if you have 1 million possibilities and the attacker can test 1,000 passwords in 1 second using a computer, so then we can easily identify. So how long the attacker will take to enumerate all the possible passwords. So in the worst case, you will need to n divided by r, so such a time, right? So the n is the number of possible passwords, r is basically the number of password that can be tested by the attacker. But the expected time actually is only half of the worst case. So this is the worst case for the attacker, and then the expected is half of this worst case. Right, so to give you some rough idea, so if you say consider a randomly generated password of length 8, and each item, each character is a random lowercase letter from A to Z. Right, so in this case, actually we can calculate what are the total possible, what's the size of the password space, what are the possible password, what is the number of possible password. So in this case, we have 26 to the power of 8, because we have 8 petitions, right? 8 petitions, each petition has 26 possibilities, so we have 26 to the power of 8. And then if we assume the attacker can test 1,000 passwords in a second, then we can simply calculate the time. So you use this number divided by this 1,000, you will get a time of 6.6 years. Although this, so this is like an artificial example. So nowadays, actually, the attacker can do password testing in a much faster rate. So in particular, if you use GPU, actually you can do the password testing very quickly because GPU can do the testing in parallel, right? So, but this is just an artificial example to illustrate the strength of the password, right? So in this case, basically, if you know it takes 6.6 years to enumerate all the possible passwords, then basically you need to make sure you will change the password before this, well before this time, because you know that if you keep the password for such a time, then attacker basically can find the password. But you need to make sure that you will change password well before this time. Okay. So if you basically, so here shows some way actually you can strengthen the password. So if you add now basically you use a password over 10 digits and the upper and the lowercase letters. So basically you enlarge the space. So now you allow the eight characters to be chosen either from the set of 10 digits or the upper and the lowercase letters. Then actually the password space will be increased by a factor of about 1,000. So this illustrates if you choose different combinations for the characters, then you can enlarge the space. Alright, so the previous examples are just some rough idea about the password space and the speed for the attacker to detect the password or to locate the password. So the formal term to describe the strength of password is the so-called password entropy. So entropy is a very important term used in information theory. So in information theory, so entropy is basically the amount of information or amount of uncertainty, or you can say amount of randomness. So if you have no randomness, no uncertainty, then you don't have any entropy. For example, suppose I pick a password. Say, I always pick a password start from SIM. SIM, I follow something else. So someone actually will pick password in this way. They have a fixed prefix. They have some fixed terms, for example, in front or at the end, and then they choose some dynamic characters in the subsequent part of the password. So in this way, actually, this is not a good way to pick password because the fixed part actually does not carry a lot of entropy. So in particular, if this fixed part is known, then it carries no entropy. Right? So if this fixed part is known by people, then it carries no entropy because there is no uncertainty inside this fixed string. Right? So the entropy basically is a number of basically possible possible passwords. And this is entropy is basically a log base 2 of the number of possible passwords. So if you have a number of possible passwords equal to n, then entropy is measured by log base 2 n. Right? So basically we measure the entropy in terms of bit because we are basically looking at the number of decisions we need to make in order to locate the correct password. Right? So if we look at the possible password, there are n possible passwords. So basically every time we can make a decision, right? When we make a decision, basically we have a yes or no, right? So that's why we use log base 2 to determine the entropy of the password. And then later, so actually we will also see that so to calculate the entropy, basically you need to look at so here you need to eliminate all the fixed items in the password. Also, the password may have very long string. It does not mean the password has a high entropy. As I mentioned, if you have a fixed part, the part is always fixed. Only the remaining part it is dynamic. Then the fixed part carries no entropy. For example, if you have some every time if you put a fixed character at the end of the password, you use the same fixed character, maybe special character. Actually, that one does not really carry entropy because there is no randomness or uncertainty in that particular part. Okay, so this is a cartoon illustrating the idea of entropy. So the result is quite surprising. So this is a so-called strong password. Usually we choose, right? So it contains upper and lowercase letters, numbers, special characters, and so on. So this password will be satisfied by most of the password systems. However, if you measure the entropy of this password, it's really not that high. So even for such a complex password, the entropy actually is only 28, right? So this kind of password may be difficult to memorize, but actually the entropy is not really that high. But if you look at this one, so if you randomly choose 4 words from the dictionary, so surprisingly, actually this one will have a higher entropy. However, so you need to make sure you choose these words randomly. So if you choose a well-known sentence, that does not count. It will provide high entropy only when you choose words randomly from the dictionary, right? So if you have 4 random words, so they are seemingly unrelated. So in this case, if you have such kind of password, actually the entropy is higher than such a strong password. Okay, so basically you can measure. So depending on how many possible English words you can have. For example, I think in a dictionary, so the common English word, maybe we have, I think in a normal English dictionary, we may have 20,000 or 30,000, around 20 to 30,000 English words. So if you randomly choose those 4 words, then you can have actually a higher entropy than choosing such a password like this. Right. So in this case, so actually this provides actually some hint to generate a strong password. Okay, so we look at some general definition and then some problems related to password. Then the next part we will look at some protecting mechanisms. So, but before doing that, maybe we have a break. We have a 10 minutes break. Then we will look at the protecting mechanisms.